a cabin of dreams. The night was cold in the Kentucky wilderness when Abraham Lincoln entered the world. February 12th, 1809. No city lights, no grand halls, only the hum of wind through trees and the soft flicker of a fire. The cabin was made of rough-hewn logs, its walls breathing with the chill of the forest. Inside, a mother whispered lullabies to her newborn son, while a father, weary and poor, watched the sparks rise and vanish into the dark. It was a humble beginning, far from power or promise. Yet history, in its quiet wisdom, often begins in silence. From the very start, Lincoln's world was shaped by simplicity. Days were long, filled with chores and labor. Nights were filled with stillness, and her words stayed with him, weaving into the fabric of his soul. She taught him kindness, patience, and the power of faith, lessons he would cling to long after she was gone. Her death came too soon. He was only 9 when she fell ill and never recovered. The cabin that once glowed with her laughter became a place of echoes. Lincoln helped his father carve her coffin, each stroke of the blade cutting deeper into his memory. Grief aged him, yet it also softened him. He learned, even then, that sorrow can make a heart wider. That in losing, one learns how to hold others closer. That lesson would one day guide a divided nation through its own mourning. After her passing, books became his solace. He borrowed them from neighbors miles away, walking barefoot across fields just to hold a few pages of another world. In those pages, he found not escape, but understanding. The words became lanterns in the darkness, not force. His father, Thomas, was practical, a man of hands, not dreams, and he often failed to see what burned inside his son. But Lincoln's hunger for learning could not be dimmed. By candlelight, he read and reread, tracing each line as though it were a promise to himself. When storms rolled across the land, he would sit by the window, watching lightning illuminate the endless horizon, wondering what lay beyond it. And somewhere in those long, still nights, a dream began to form. Not the kind of dream that shouts, but one that hums quietly. The dream of a better life, a better country. He did not yet know its name nor its weight, but deep inside, something told him that his life was meant for more than the fields and fences of the frontier. Something told him that words, once spoken with truth and tenderness, could move mountains. Years would pass, and the cabin would fade into memory. But the boy who grew up among trees and silence carried its lessons. The restless wanderer, when the boy who once read by firelight grew tall enough to touch the doorframe of his father's cabin, the world around him began to feel too small. The forests that once whispered adventure now whispered something else. The call to move, to see, to find his place beyond the horizon. And so, like the restless rivers that carved through Kentucky soil, Abraham Lincoln's life began to flow forward. His family moved west, into Indiana first, then Illinois, chasing land, chasing luck. The moves were hard. Each time they packed, it meant leaving behind not just walls and wood, but fragments of memory, the ghost of his mother's voice, the smell of rain on familiar earth. But Lincoln, though quiet, carried those ghosts gently. Every loss made him kinder. Every mile made him wiser. He grew into a man of labor. His hands, once meant for books, grew rough from rail splitting, fence building, ferry work. He could lift, haul, yet his thoughts often drifted elsewhere, toward stories, toward people, toward the world beyond the next hill. Even while working, he would pause to listen, to the sound of water, the wind through corn, the faint hum of life itself. There was something in him that refused to harden. When he first struck out on his own, he carried little more than determination. He worked on flatboats down the Mississippi, navigating the long, slow current of America's soul. From the free North to the slave South, there, he saw it for the first time. Men and women in chains, their eyes hollow with despair. The image stayed with him like a scar, carved deep beneath his calm exterior. He spoke little of it then, but a quiet rage began to stir. Not the rage of violence, but the kind that waits, that gathers strength in silence. In New Salem, Illinois, he found a town that suited his restless heart. It was small, but alive, full of laughter, trade. Lincoln began to build something new, a sense of belonging. He clerked in a general store, his humor and honesty quickly earning him a reputation. Customers would linger just to hear him tell a story or settle a dispute with gentle wit. He never mocked, never spoke down. He simply understood people, and people, in turn, began to understand him. At night, after the store closed, he read by candlelight again, volumes of law, history, and philosophy. He was teaching himself to think deeply, to speak clearly, to lead quietly. Each page was a step toward a new destiny, though he could not yet see the path forming beneath his feet. Sometimes he would wander outside, gaze at the stars, and whisper to the night as though asking it where his road might lead. The stars, of course, gave no answer, but they listened. Life in New Salem was not, but fate was cruel again. She fell ill and died before their love could truly bloom. Lincoln was shattered. Those who knew him said he changed after her passing, became quieter, more inward, more fragile in the heart. He walked the riverbanks alone for weeks, speaking to no one, staring into the water as though trying to see her reflection. From that sorrow, his empathy deepened even further, and his laughter, when it returned, carried both joy and pain in equal measure. Yet life moved forward, as it always does. Lincoln left New Salem and carried its lessons with him. That kindness mattered, that grief could make a man gentler, and that failure was not the end, but the soil from which character grows. The wanderer who once sought a place to belong began to realize that belonging comes not from land or work, but from purpose. And somewhere deep within, he began to sense when Lincoln first began studying law, it was not in grand lecture halls or under the guidance of scholars. It was alone, a candle, a book, a quiet determination. He had no formal education, no mentor to guide his hand. But what he lacked in privilege, he replaced with persistence. Each evening, after long days of work, he would sit by the fire and trace the lines of legal texts with patient eyes. Slowly, painfully, he taught himself to understand the law, not as words on paper, but as a moral compass that could protect the weak from the powerful. When he finally earned the right to practice, his first cases were small and ordinary. Debts, land disputes, petty crimes. But in each, he brought a rare kind of honesty. He never twisted truth to win. He traveled constantly, riding horseback from town to town along what was called the 8th Judicial Circuit. The roads were muddy, the inns sparse, but he didn't mind. Those long rides through wind and dust gave him time to think about people, about freedom, about the strange, fragile thing called democracy. Often, as the sun sank low, he would dismount to share a simple meal with a farmer or a blacksmith, listening to their stories. Each encounter left an imprint. He began to see the fabric of the nation, woven from the laughter of its workers, the tears of its mothers, the sweat of its poor. Lincoln's humor became legendary on those journeys. Around campfires, he would tell stories that made even the sternest judges laugh. His wit was gentle, never cruel, and it carried a warmth that drew people near. Yet behind his kindness made him beloved, but it also made him vulnerable. Still, he wore that tenderness like armor. In a world of bluster and pride, his humility shone brighter than any polished speech. In the courtroom, his manner was simple, but powerful. He spoke slowly, clearly, his voice low and steady. Jurors leaned forward, captivated, not by theatrics, but by sincerity. When he defended the innocent, his words seemed to flow, not from intellect alone, but from conscience. When he prosecuted the guilty, it was with sorrow, not fury. Mercy, he once said quietly, bears better fruit than punishment. There was one case that came to define him: the trial of a young man accused of murder. The evidence was damning, the crowd eager for blood. But Lincoln saw something others did not: doubt. He studied the witnesses, noticed contradictions, and, in a moment of brilliance, revealed that a key wit because the moon that night had been too dim. The boy was freed. When it was over, Lincoln didn't celebrate. He simply placed a hand on the mother's shoulder and said, "He's yours again." That quiet compassion traveled faster than any headline. As his reputation grew, so did his understanding of justice. he began to see how deeply the question of slavery shadowed the very law he served. Each time he traveled southward and saw the chains, his heart grew heavier. How could a nation built on liberty live with such contradiction? The thought lingered, growing louder with each case, each face, each night on the road. And yet, through all the toil and doubt, Lincoln remained grounded. He returned often to his modest home, to his wife Mary, and to their growing family. The laughter of children softened the edges of his burdens. But even in those rare moments of peace, he could feel history stirring around him. For years, he rode the circuit, arguing for farmers and merchants, shaking hands in taverns, sleeping under stars. In those open skies and dusty courthouses, he earned not only his living, he earned the trust of a people. Trust, born from integrity, would soon become the foundation of something far greater than the law itself. As he packed his satchel one last time, preparing to leave behind the familiar roads of the prairie, Lincoln looked out over the golden fields swaying in the breeze. The land that had shaped him, simple, vast, unpretentious, seemed to nod in silent farewell. He was no longer just a lawyer of the prairie. He was becoming something else, a conscience awakening to its purpose. And so, beneath the endless American sky, the lawyer rode on, toward politics, toward conflict, toward the test that would define both him and the nation he loved. A burden of politics. The decision to enter politics did not come to Lincoln as a rush of ambition, but as a quiet calling, a soft tug at the edge of his conscience. By then, he had tasted success as a lawyer, had earned respect as a man of integrity, but something within him remained unsettled. The courtroom, though full of stories, was too small for the questions echoing in his mind. Questions about freedom, justice, and the fragile promise of equality that America had made but not yet kept. He began modestly, stepping into the Illinois legislature, a tall, awkward figure among men who spoke loudly and moved swiftly. Lincoln was not like them. He was deliberate, often silent until the right moment. When he did speak, his words carried a kind of stillness that silenced the room. He spoke not to impress, but to understand, to bridge. Yet even in those early days, he felt the strain, the burden that came with compromise. The halls of power were thick with self-interest and noise. He often returned home weary, his shoulders bowed by the weight of what he saw: corruption, hypocrisy, and the slow erosion of truth beneath ambition. But he did not despair. Instead, he learned the art of patience, how to wait, how to persuade without anger, how to hold conviction like a candle in the wind. It was during these years that the issue of slavery began to shadow every conversation, every debate. To many, it was politics. To Lincoln, it was moral thunder in the distance. He had seen the faces of the enslaved, had heard their silence. The thought haunted him. Still, he spoke carefully, aware of how fragile the Union was, a country split not only by borders, but by conscience. He knew that one wrong word could shatter more than his career. It could shatter the very peace of the land. His speeches grew sharper, though always measured. In taverns and town halls, he stood before crowds of farmers and laborers, his long fingers resting on a worn lectern, his eyes searching theirs. "If slavery is not wrong," he once said softly, "nothing is wrong." The simplicity of those words carried more power than any shout could. He was not trying to inflame, he was trying to awaken. Still, opposition followed him like a shadow. Many mocked him for his plain looks. His rural drawl, his lack of polish. Some called him naive, others dangerous. But Lincoln, ever humble, bore their scorn with a wry smile. He did not see politics as a battlefield, but as a burden, a duty to carry truth as gently as possible through a storm of deceit. He lost elections. He failed, time and again. He began to realize that leadership was not about victory, but about resilience, about standing upright, even when the world turns away. During these years, he also faced trials at home. His marriage to Mary Todd was filled with affection, but also friction. She, spirited and ambitious, saw greatness in him long before he did. Yet the pressures of politics, financial struggle, and personal loss often pressed hard upon their hearts. 2 of their sons died young, small coffins in the White House's future, but already foreshadowed by grief in the Lincoln home. Each tragedy left its mark. Each deepened his empathy, turning his sorrow into something sacred, a bridge between his pain and the suffering of others. As the 1850s arrived, the storm that had been gathering for decades began to break. The nation quarreled bitterly over new territories, whether they would be free or enslaved. It was no longer a question politicians could avoid. And in that tension, Lincoln found his moment. His debates with Senator Stephen Douglas would thrust him from local obscurity into national spotlight. Though he lost the Senate race, his words, calm, reasoned, piercing, spread like wildfire through print and rumor. America had found in him something rare, a leader who spoke not from arrogance, but from conscience. He did not yet know it, but his path was already set. Every courtroom argument, every lonely night of study, every heartbreak had prepared him for what lay ahead. The burdens he once thought his own were, in truth, the burdens of a nation he would soon carry. And so, as Lincoln stood beneath the evening sky after one of his long debates, the crowd dispersing into darkness, he looked up and whispered something only the stars could hear. Perhaps it was a prayer, perhaps a question. But whatever it was born of quiet resolve. The burden of politics had become his cross to bear, and he would carry it, not for glory, but for the fragile dream of a united, just America. And so, as the night deepened and the country's divisions grew louder, Lincoln's quiet journey pressed on toward the moment when his voice would finally awaken a nation torn between its conscience and its comfort. The House divided. By the summer of 1858, the nation was trembling on a fault line. Every conversation, in taverns, churches, and newspapers, circled the same unspoken fear that America, proud and growing, was tearing itself apart. The question of slavery had ceased to be an argument of policy. It had become an argument of soul. And into this storm, Abraham Lincoln stepped, not with fire in his voice, but with the calm precision of a man who had spent his life listening to silence. When he stood before the crowd at the Illinois state capitol that June, the air was thick with his frame, tall and angular. His speeches that year would become the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, a clash not just of men, but of moral worlds. Stephen Douglas, polished and commanding, defended popular sovereignty, the idea that each state should choose for itself whether to keep slavery. Lincoln disagreed. He saw it not as choice, but as moral evasion. To him, the question was simple. If slavery is wrong, it cannot be right anywhere. The debates drew thousands. Farmers, merchants, and mothers stood under open skies for hours, listening to two men shape the destiny of a nation with words. Lincoln, though less graceful in form, possessed something deeper: sincerity. He spoke to the conscience of the crowd, not just their politics. His voice rose and fell like a prayer, filled with sorrow more than anger, conviction more than pride. When the debates ended, Douglas won the Senate seat, but Lincoln had won, reaching homes and hearts across the North. To many, he became a symbol of reason in an age of rage, a man who could speak truth without hate, courage without cruelty. Yet even as his name began to rise, Lincoln remained grounded. He returned to Springfield quietly, resumed his law practice, and walked to the office each day with his usual modesty. Neighbors would nod, children would wave, and he would tip his hat with a gentle smile. Fame had not changed him. If anything, it had humbled him further. He often told friends, "I am nothing, but truth is everything." At night, when the town had gone still, he would sit in his chair by the window, reading by the faint glow of a lamp. The world outside seemed fragile. Mary saw it too. The growing distance in his eyes, the weight on his shoulders. Sometimes she would find him staring into nothing, lost in thought. When she asked what troubled him, he would smile faintly and say, "I see a dark cloud forming, Mary, but there is light beyond it, if we can only hold on." The House divided speech became his turning point, the moment, perhaps more than anyone, that even a house divided could someday become a home again. And as night fell on that chapter of his life, the stars above Springfield shone a little brighter, as though lighting the way for the weary man who would soon be called to lead his country through its darkest dawn. The President of Shadows. The year was 1860. Across America, the winds carried whispers of disunion, the kind of low, uneasy murmur that comes before a storm. Towns divided, families quarreled, and in the distance, something vast and terrible stirred. Abraham Lincoln, still the modest lawyer from Illinois, watched it all unfold with quiet eyes. He had not sought greatness. It had crept toward him instead, step by step, speech by speech, until the weight of the nation rested invisibly upon his shoulders. When his name was first put forward for the presidency, even he was startled. He laughed softly. I suppose I must not decline the work. But beneath the humor lay unease. He knew what the office meant now. Not honor, not power, but burden. For whoever became president next would inherit a country coming apart at its seams. His campaign was a strange one. He never traveled far, never shouted slogans or promised miracles. Instead, he stayed in Springfield, answering letters, receiving visitors, and trusting that truth, once spoken, had its own momentum. While others thundered from platforms, Lincoln wrote with calm precision, weaving words that reached both the mind and the conscience. And so, almost quietly, he won. The announcement came on a gray November evening. Fireworks burst over Chicago. Bands played. Crowds cheered. But in Lincoln's small home on 8th Street, the celebration was subdued. Mary approached him gently. "You've done it, Abraham," she said. He turned to her, his voice soft. "No, Mary, we've all done it, and now the real work begins." Outside, the streets filled with jubilation. Inside, Lincoln felt only a solemn quiet. The quiet of a man who knew that joy and sorrow often walk hand in hand. Because even before his inauguration, the Union began to crumble. South Carolina seceded first, then Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. One by one, the stars of the flag began to dim. Letters poured in, some congratulatory, others venomous. Newspapers called him a tyrant, a fool, a destroyer. Yet Lincoln never responded with anger. He read every word, sighed, and said only, "We must not hate, for hate is the other man's weapon." When he finally left Springfield for Washington in February 1861, the air was cold and brittle. The train station was packed with neighbors, friends, and townsfolk. He climbed the platform, looked out over the crowd, and gave his farewell. He spoke simply, without flourish. "My friends, no one not in my position can appreciate the sadness I feel at this parting. I go to assume a task greater than that which rested upon Washington himself. Without your prayers, I cannot succeed. With them, I cannot fail." Many wept, some waved. The train whistle blew, and slowly the engine carried him away. His speech that day was not triumphant but pleading, a call to reason. "We are not enemies, but friends," he said. "Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." Those words drifted across the crowd and vanished into the cold air, unheard by those already choosing war. Within weeks, cannons thundered at Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun. And so the gentle lawyer from Illinois found himself the commander of armies, the guardian of a nation at war with itself. Nights grew long, and the light in the White House burned later than ever. Often, he could be seen walking the halls alone, his face gaunt, his shoulders stooped, whispering prayers into the silence. He wrote letters to grieving mothers with his own hand, visited soldiers in hospitals, and rode alone through the rain to battlefield camps. He belongs to the ages, someone would one day say. But in those years, he belonged to sorrow. Lived a quiet ache, the ache of a man who felt every death as a personal failure, every victory as a fragile reprieve. Yet even in the darkest moments, Lincoln never lost faith. Not in God, not in people, not in the better angels of human nature. He once told a visitor, "I have been driven many times to my knees by the overwhelming conviction that I had nowhere else to go." In that confession lay the heart of his strength. Not pride, but humility. Not certainty, but compassion. And so, in the shadow of war, under the dim glow of candlelight, Abraham Lincoln began to lead, not as a conqueror, but as a healer. A man haunted by the suffering of others, and guided always by the faint, flickering belief that love, even bruised, even bloodied, could still redeem a broken world. The Emancipation dawned. The war had become a long night, one of those endless, dreamless nights that seemed to swallow time itself, filled with telegrams, morning letters. Every morning, Abraham Lincoln rose before the sun, weary but resolute. His nation was bleeding, and he carried its pain like a hidden wound. He watched the casualty lists grow longer, the news darker. Fields once golden with wheat now burned black with smoke. Families divided by belief now stood on opposite sides of battlefields. He read reports by candlelight, his face a shadowed portrait of exhaustion. And yet, through that smoke and sorrow, a single thought kept returning: freedom. He had seen slavery with his own eyes decades earlier on the Mississippi, and it had never left him. The image of men in chains haunted him like a recurring dream. The sound of a whip cracking, the silence of those who could not speak. Now, as president, he had the power to change that dream into something new. But it was not so simple. Freedom, to Lincoln, was both moral and fragile. An idea that could heal. His cabinet urged caution. Some generals warned that such an act might drive the border states to rebellion. Others whispered that it was too soon, too bold, too dangerous. Lincoln listened quietly, as he always did. Then, in that soft, steady voice, he said, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong." Still he waited, not out of fear, but out of patience. He knew timing was everything. He waited for the moment when the nation was ready to hear the truth it had long refused to face. That moment came after Antietam, a field soaked in blood, where over 20,000 men fell in a single day. It was victory, but barely. Lincoln walked among the wounded afterward, his boots heavy with mud, his eyes full of grief. He saw the price of every inch of progress and decided then and there that something greater had to rise from that agony. Soon after, in the quiet of his study, his pen scratched slowly across the page, every word deliberate, every stroke of ink a promise to history. That on the first day of January, in the year of our Lord, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. He read it aloud to himself. The words trembled in the air, fragile yet powerful, like a candle lit in darkness. When he finally shared it with his cabinet, the room fell silent. Some protested, some nodded gravely, but none could deny the weight of the moment. Lincoln looked around and said quietly, "I made a covenant with my Maker. I must keep my word." And so, on January 1st, 1863, the world changed. The sky over Washington was gray and cold. Crowds gathered outside the White House as the president, weary but determined, lifted his pen once more. His hand shook, not from. He paused, took a breath, and whispered, "If my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it." Then he sighed. The ink dried, and with it, centuries of suffering began to lift. Not all at once, not everywhere, but enough for the dawn to break. Words spread like sunlight. From plantation to plantation, from camp to camp, the message traveled. Whispered, sung, prayed, free, free. Men and women fell to their knees. Tears cutting through dirt-streaked faces. Songs rose up in fields where only cries had echoed before. The war still raged, but hope had entered the fire. Lincoln received letters from former slaves who called him Father Abraham. He read them quietly, his eyes misting over. "They call me Father," he once said softly. "God knows I have not always been worthy of the name." But in that moment, he was more than a president. He was the keeper of a promise that freedom belonged to every soul, not as a gift, but as a birthright. And yet, as he looked out from his office window toward the battle-scarred land beyond, Lincoln knew that freedom was only the beginning. The war still thundered on, and the cost was still unimaginable. He turned back to his desk, the candlelight flickering across his tired face. Outside, the bells of Washington began to ring. Slow, solemn, but bright with something new. Not victory, not yet, but awakening. Lincoln closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over him. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of grief and responsibility, a single truth took root. The darkest nights often birth the most radiant dawns. And so, as the smoke of war drifted into the horizon, the Emancipation dawn rose quietly, a fragile light that promised, one day, the night would end. The weight of war. By the time 1863 turned to 1864, the Civil War and countless lives, America, once a landscape of hope, had become a scarred battlefield stretching from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. Cities that had once sung with commerce now echoed with silence, and Lincoln, in the heart of Washington, bore the weight of it all. He walked the dim corridors of the White House like a ghost of his former self, thinner, older, his eyes carrying the weariness of 1,000 sleepless nights. The laughter that once came easily now felt like a stranger he hadn't seen in years. Even his close friends noticed the change. "He looks," one said, "as though sorrow had been carved into his very bones." Every day brought news of more loss. Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, each name etched itself into Lincoln's heart like a wound that refused to heal. He often stood by the telegraph office late into the night, waiting for messages from the front. Sometimes painfully still. When the worst reports came, Lincoln would lower his head, close his eyes, and whisper, "Too many sons, too many sons." He had seen the mothers who came to the White House gates, begging for word of their boys. He had held the letters of soldiers who wrote to him directly, some pleading for courage, others saying goodbye. He read each one with trembling hands. To many, Lincoln was now the great emancipator, but to himself, he was a man haunted by the cost of every decision. He once said, "I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me." And yet, through the chaos, his compass never wavered. He still believed that the Union, this fragile experiment of freedom, must endure, not just for America, but for humanity itself. There were days he left the White House unannounced, slipping through the streets toward the hospitals where wounded soldiers lay. He would walk between rows of cots, stopping at each one, speaking softly to men whose faces were pale and bandaged, whose eyes glimmered with pain. "Where are you from, son?" he'd ask. Sometimes the soldiers were too weak to answer. Sometimes they'd smile faintly and whisper, "Springfield, sir." He'd nod, place a trembling hand on their shoulder, and say, "Then we are neighbors." And for a brief, fragile moment, the war felt far away. His own family suffered too. His young son, Willie, bright, gentle, and adored, fell ill with typhoid in 1862 and died in the White House. The loss shattered him. Friends said they found him late at night in the boy's room, sitting in the darkness, speaking softly as though to someone still there. Mary grieved deeply too, her sorrow often turning to hysteria. Lincoln never blamed her. He simply held her hand and whispered, "We must both." The Union armies began to grind forward under General Grant, inch by inch, through mud and blood. Victory was coming, but it came slowly, at a price too vast for counting. Lincoln visited Grant at the front once, and as they stood together, watching the soldiers march, he said quietly, "These men will never know how deeply I owe them." He carried that sense of debt like a chain around his heart. Every night, he prayed, sometimes aloud, sometimes silently. He did not pray for victory. He prayed for mercy, for strength, for understanding. "If I can save one heart from breaking, I shall not have lived in vain." Then came Gettysburg, 3 days that defined the soul of the nation. When the battle ended, Lincoln rode there quietly, walking among the graves. Thousands of white markers stretched to the horizon, like waves frozen in time. Standing before the small crowd that gathered to dedicate the cemetery, he spoke only 2 minutes, just 272 words. "The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here," he began softly, "but it can never forget what they did here." And though he believed those words modest, they would outlive him, because in that moment, in that breath of poetry and sorrow, Lincoln gave the war meaning. He turned tragedy into testimony, blood into purpose, and death into remembrance. As 1864 dawned, victory seemed closer, but Lincoln knew peace was still far away. The closer the Union came to triumph, the darker the hate around him grew. Threats filled his mail. Assassins were whispered about in taverns. Yet he walked through it all with calm grace, telling a guard one night, "If it is my time, then it is my time. I must not live in fear." The war was ending, but its shadow lingered, a weight that bent his spirit, but never broke it. Because even in the heart of darkness, Abraham Lincoln carried one unshakable light: the belief that compassion could outlast cruelty, and that love, even scarred and sorrowful, could bind a broken nation back together. And so, as the fires of war began to fade, Lincoln, gaunt, grieving, but steadfast, prepared to guide America into its most fragile dawn yet, the healing of a nation. By the spring of 1865, the thunder of cannon fire was fading into distant memory. The air that once trembled with war now hung still, fragile, uncertain, as though the land itself was holding it. The promise of peace flickered like a candle in the dark. Abraham Lincoln rode through the streets of Washington as the city erupted in celebration. Crowds sang, flags waved, church bells rang through the night. Yet, even in victory, Lincoln's face remained thoughtful, solemn. He smiled gently to those who cheered him, but behind that smile lay something deeper: the quiet grief of a man who had seen too much. He had dreamt of this day countless times, but now that it had come, his heart was heavy. "We must not exult over our fallen foes," he said softly to those beside him. "They are our countrymen again." For Lincoln, the war's end was not a moment for vengeance. It was a moment for mercy. He knew that the hardest battle was just beginning, the healing of a nation torn apart. When he traveled to the fallen Confederate capital of Richmond, he did not arrive as a conqueror. No soldiers marched before him. He walked quietly through the streets, his boots splashing in puddles left by the recent rain. Former slaves recognized him and gathered around, their faces full of awe. Some knelt before him, tears streaming down their cheeks. Lincoln stopped them gently, saying, "Don't kneel to me. You must kneel only to God. You are free now, and free forever." Those words echoed through the ruins of the old city like a benediction. It was not the sound of triumph, but of release, the long sigh of a nation exhaling after years of holding its pain. Back in Washington, the work of rebuilding began. Lincoln's mind turned not to punishment, but reconciliation. He spoke of amnesty, of compassion, of binding up the nation's wounds. His cabinet, weary and divided, urged him to be firm with the South. But Lincoln only shook his head. "Let us have malice toward none," he said. "Charity for all." Those words, later immortalized in his second inaugural address, were not just rhetoric. They were his prayer for the soul of America. Standing on the steps of the Capitol that March day, rain falling softly on his shoulders, he looked out over the crowd. Soldiers missing limbs, widows in black, freedmen clutching their children, and spoke as a father might to grieving children. With malice toward none, with charity for all, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. The crowd stood silent. Some wept openly. It was as though every pain, every loss, every buried dream of the past 4 years found a voice in his words. At night, when the city slept, Lincoln often sat alone in his study. The fire burned low. Papers lay scattered across his desk. He would pick up letters, sometimes from soldiers, sometimes from freed families, and read them with misted eyes. He spoke softly to himself, not in speech. "Have I done right in thy sight?" Mary would find him there sometimes, staring into the fire. "You worry too much, Abraham," she'd say. He'd smile faintly. "I've carried this nation too long not to worry, Mary. But I feel it is almost time to rest." The war had aged him beyond his years. His once dark hair was streaked with silver, his face lined, his shoulders slumped. But in his eyes, there was still that same deep kindness, the same patient understanding that had guided him from the prairies of Illinois to the highest seat in the land. He began to dream again, not of war, but of peace. He spoke of traveling once the conflict was over. "We'll visit the theater, Mary," he told her one evening, smiling softly. "We'll laugh again. God knows we've earned that much." He had plans, too, gentle, hopeful plans. He wanted to visit the South himself, to see the people, to talk with them, to be a must-see. "I bear no malice," he told his advisors, "only a wish to make us whole again." In those final weeks, the White House felt different. The tension that had once filled its halls was replaced by something lighter, cautious joy, fragile but real. The war was ending. The blood had been shed, the promise kept. Lincoln often spoke of it, as though describing a sunrise after the longest night. "The world," he said quietly one morning, looking out the window, "is beginning to look new again." But even as light crept back into the land, shadows lingered close behind. In the taverns and alleys of Washington, anger still brewed. Some whispered that the South's honor was gone, that Lincoln had ruined them. Others called him a tyrant, a destroyer of states. He knew it. He felt it. But he never let fear rule his heart. "If I am killed," he once told a friend, "I must die some." As cherry blossoms drifted through the Capitol like pink snow, Abraham Lincoln, weary, gentle, and filled with hope, began to believe that the war within him might finally be ending too. But history, like the wind, often changes without warning. And as the sun set on April 14th, 1865, the healing of the nation was only beginning. Though for Lincoln, it would be his final gift to the world. The final night. Even the most tireless hearts must rest. Yet for Abraham Lincoln, rest was always fleeting. On the evening of April 14th, 1865, the White House felt unusually quiet, though Washington itself buzzed with the residual joy of victory and the cautious celebration as peace. The war had ended. The nation, battered and grieving, was beginning to breathe again. And for a moment, it seemed as if the long night had finally softened. Lincoln attended a performance at Ford's Theater with Mary that night, a rare evening of respite. He smiled more easily than he had in years, his tall frame relaxed in the theater box. Mary leaned close, her fingers brushing his, whispering the comfort that only a spouse can give. "Tonight," she said, "you can forget the weight of the world." He nodded, allowing himself a faint, fleeting laugh. The play began, the music lifted, and for a few hours, the grief and burden of 4 long years melted into the warm glow of stage lights. He leaned back, watching the actors move across the boards, marveling at how ordinary life could feel miraculous after so much bloodshed. In though an assassin had planned this night with patient malice, unseen in the laughter and applause, Lincoln, absorbed in the fleeting peace, noticed nothing. When the gun fired, the world seemed to tilt. A single, piercing note of violence shattered the fragile calm. Lincoln's body slumped, the stage's light glancing across his pale face. Mary screamed. The theater plunged into chaos. And yet, even in the midst of horror, Lincoln's life did not end in noise alone. There was a strange, almost sacred stillness that followed, a quiet gravity, as though the universe itself were holding its breath. He was carried back to the White House, surrounded by aides and doctors, but the room felt impossibly silent. Outside, the city did not yet know that it had lost its guiding star. Inside, the shadows of history drew closer. Lincoln lay on the bed, the weight of the nation still pressing upon him, even in his final moments. He whispered softly, barely audible, a voice almost drowned by the panic around him. Words meant not for the world, but for Mary, for God, for the ages. It is all right. It is all right. He had lived through darkness, the frontier, heartbreak, the endless trials of war. He had carried sorrow and hope in equal measure, and even as life ebbed away, he remained a vessel of compassion. No hatred lingered, no anger, only the quiet understanding that the work of a nation must continue beyond the life of one man. By morning, Abraham Lincoln was gone, but the echo of his voice, his gentle moral insistence, the patient strength of his character, these remained. The Union he had preserved would survive. The people he had fought for, enslaved and free, would move forward, carrying the promise of freedom into generations yet unborn. His death was a wound to the nation. And yet, in sorrow, there was reflection. In the pain, a lesson whispered softly. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the persistence of love, despite it. Mercy can outlast anger. Even the darkest night yields to dawn. As the sun rose over Washington on April 15, 1865, the city wept quietly. But the light touched the Capitol, the memorials, the river, and the fields beyond. A reminder that Abraham Lincoln had not walked in darkness for himself alone. He had carried America with him through sorrow, through battle, through the long, trembling nights. And so, as the nation began to heal, His story continued in the quiet of homes, in the halls of learning, in the whispers of children asking why freedom matters. For Lincoln had given them more than a union preserved. He had given them a vision of humanity's better angels, patience, compassion, and the belief that even in suffering, we could rise together. And somewhere, in the hush of the wind through the trees and the shimmer of the morning sun, Abraham Lincoln's journey lived on, not as a shadow of loss, but as a light that would guide a country forever.